For the member for Laylaw.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak on this important piece of legislation and to support this piece of legislation. Obviously, the Combating Multinational Tax Avoidance Bill 2015, as has been debated today, is being supported by those of us on this side. And of course, this bill was motivated by information that suggested multinational companies worth billions of dollars operating in this country, that is, trading, selling, making a profit, were not paying their fair share of tax. Deputy Speaker, like most Australians, I was surprised to learn that this could be the case. And of course, this issue arose at a difficult time for the government in the wash-up of their 2014 budget, at the height of the debate about that first budget, the budget that was focused on cutting spending, with lots of rhetoric around cutting spending to pay down debt and deficit. And then, lo and behold, we find that we have multinational companies exposed by journalists in this country not paying their fair share. Now, like all PAYG taxpayers, I was appalled. And in that context, it quickly moved the debate of the time from a question around spending. It shifted that debate, and most Australians then started to look at a review of revenue, to the revenue side of the country's balance sheet, if you like. Now, Deputy Speaker, it was an interesting time in the national debate in that post-2014 budget, because it brought our attention sharply to what is spending and what should we count on in revenue in this country. And of course, we had a government who was telling us that there was debt and deficit after they'd doubled the deficit, and had become now the highest tax in government since John Howard was Prime Minister. So this exposure that multinationals were not paying their fair share in this country really did sharpen that debate. And the brouhaha caused by the multinational tax avoidance practices have left many Australians very interested in the international tax system, much more interested than they would have been in the past. And it brings to bear on this chamber to ensure that transparency around taxation is what the Australian public are getting now every time we stand to debate taxation, because it has left simmering in the minds of the public the question about who is paying their fair share. And of course, it wasn't helped by the case studies that came out of the Senate inquiry, where LuxLeaks, where documents leaked in 2014 showed that over 300 Australian firms had been involved in routing money through Luxembourg and other low-tax jurisdictions to minimise their Australian tax bills. Firms named in media reports included AMP, Macquarie Group and Lendlease. The amount of tax avoided through these schemes potentially reaches into billions of dollars. And it raises the question around the transparency. And of course, this government's just passed legislation to limit transparency around millionaires and their tax, the details of the tax that they're paying. And I suppose I want to speak on this bill today because I want to speak for the people of Lalor, to represent them here, to say that what they want is transparency. They want to know when companies aren't paying appropriate tax, because the only thing the man in the street can do about that is to hear that name of that company and determine that they don't want to do business with them. So I think it's really important that through this process, through the Senate inquiry, we've heard some of those names, and some of those names are household names, as we've just heard, in discussions around the iPhone and which piece of it should be paid tax in this country. Well, the people of Lalor, Deputy Speaker, believe that Australia is more than a marketplace for big business. They believe it's a community. And of course, our taxes every one of us that pays taxes knows that we're making a contribution not just to the country but to that community. And Australians, at the very core of them, believe that everybody should pay their fair share. And Australians also understand that the taxes that they pay, whether it be personal tax, whether it be company tax, that it goes to running the country, that our taxes pay for our roads, for transport, for rail, for our schools, for the justice system that we rely upon, for the public service, for defence, Deputy Speaker, for our universities that train our next generation. Our taxes pay for the infrastructure like the NBN. And the simplest test that most Australians would apply to the question of multinationals making a contribution in this country is pretty simple. Do these companies utilise these nationally provided systems? And if we go back through them, well, of course they do. Do they utilise our roads, our rail, our transport systems? Of course they do. Do they get value from our school system? Well, of course they do. If they're employing Australians, then they're relying on that school system to deliver them quality students and quality workers. Do they rely on the justice system? Most definitely, Deputy Speaker. If the multinationals have an issue, they do have redress through our court system. In fact, many people may argue they make better use of them most of the Australian citizenry. Do they make use of the public service? Of course they do. Do they make use of our universities? Of course they do. So all of the things that our taxes go to pay for, the multinationals have access to and make use of. So it is absolutely reasonable that they be expected to pay their fair share for doing business in this country. And I don't think there's a person in Australia that doesn't believe that that's the case. So in terms of this piece of legislation and what it might do to ensure that, this side obviously supports it. But we would also ask that the measures that we have put forward as part of our policy, that in the spirit of that same bipartisanship, that those opposite would take that into consideration and introduce legislation that would ensure those loopholes are also closed. Because, Deputy Speaker, the average taxpayer, the average waged person, pays tax to the tune of 21% of their income, and small businesses 30% in corporate tax. So it is absolutely reasonable that when you compare that to what we've heard in terms of multinational corporations and the way they have been able to use both the Australian tax system and tax systems in other countries, that they have paid less than that. In fact, the Senate's recent corporate tax inquiry heard evidence that one big multinational firm may have paid as little as 2% tax on billions of dollars in revenue. If the average Australian wage earner paid tax at that rate instead of the standard 21%, they'd be paying almost $15,000 a year less. So it is perfectly reasonable that in this country we ask those multinationals to pay their fair share. And without strong action to tackle multicultural profit shifting and corporate tax avoidance, Australia will continue to lose millions or even billions of dollars in foregone tax revenues. And with government debt continuing to rise under the coalition, we cannot afford to let tax revenue drain away offshore. Which brings us back to this chamber where we hear day in, day out about the spend, with a government that's prepared and has demonstrated for the last 2 years that they are prepared to break the social compact with the Australian public, to punish the disadvantaged, to suggest that all issues in our national accounts come down to spending, when clearly here we see that there are revenue issues, and we see a government who's prepared to do some things about changing that balance, but not enough to come to a bipartisan agreement with Labor in terms of the introductions of our policy. Because Labor is taking a positive policy And we're asking for a bipartisan approach to that important issue as well. That in that same spirit, the government should adopt our $7.2 billion tax package and tackle all the loopholes that let companies send their profits offshore. This is a reasonable thing to ask, Deputy Speaker, a very reasonable thing to ask. And of course, we also need to note that that is costed. It's costed at $7.2 billion, while those opposite are bringing this legislation in, and in the budget papers it's delineated in terms of what it will save or what it will accrue to a few asterisks. Today, in question time, the Treasurer answered that it's hundreds of millions of dollars. I take little comfort in a Treasurer who talks in hundreds of millions rather than a specific figure, while we're actually debating this piece of legislation in the Parliament. So I was aghast in question time today, when the question was asked, not to get a clear, costed answer. But nonetheless, we'll support this legislation. We're supporting this multinational tax bill through the Parliament because we believe tackling tax avoidance and protecting Australia's revenue base should be above politics. We're disappointed that the $7.2 billion multinational tax plan that we have as policy has not yet been adopted, but hopeful that rather than have Australians taken for mugs, the government will come on board and implement that as well. And Deputy Speaker, I'd finish by saying that the question of transparency is at the heart of this for the Australian people. We shouldn't be relying on journalists to determine where we've missed picking up revenue from multinational companies doing business in this country. And this government should act to ensure transparency around tax arrangements so that Australians can feel confident that when they're hearing about spending, they have a government that is equally committed to ensuring the revenue streams that Australians are entitled to. It is, of course, critical that this legislation be passed quickly and be acted upon quickly. And I would also suggest it is critical that those changes be monitored. As we've heard across today's debate, tax is complex. Someone likened it earlier to shifting sands or trying to hold on to sand in your hand. It is important that the Australian Taxation Office remain nimble, remain alert, and be watching the way the tax system is being employed and used by multinationals to ensure that we continue to change the laws as they're required and ensure that revenue stream for Australians. And I just would make this one further comment, and that is, for those opposite to argue that for 6 years this occurred and a Labor government did nothing to stop it, it belies their own assessment that these things occur because multinational corporations are changing so quickly, because the way our markets work are changing so quickly. So I think it's important that in a bipartisan way we work together to ensure that we remain agile and that the Tax Office is given the appropriate resourcing to ensure that they are delivering to the Australian public all tax revenue that is due to this country. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.